Okay, it's time for Chapter 10. Pippi Acts as a Lifesaver. One Sunday afternoon, Pippi sat wondering what to do. Tommy and Annika had gone to a tea party with their mother and father, so she knew she couldn't expect a visit from them. The day had been filled with pleasant tasks. She had got up early and served Mr. Nelson fruit, juice, and buns in bed. He looked so cute sitting there in his light blue nightshirt, holding the glass in both hands. Then she had fed and groomed the horse and told him a long story of her adventures at sea. Next, she had gone into the parlor and painted a large picture on the wallpaper. The picture represented a fat lady in a red dress and a black hat. In one hand, she held a yellow flower, and in the other, a dead rat. Pippi thought it was a very beautiful picture. It dressed up the whole room. Then she had sat down in front of her chest and looked at all her birds' eggs and shells, and thought about the wonderful places where she and her father had collected them, and about all the pleasant little shops all over the world where they had brought the beautiful things that were now in the drawers of her chest. Then she had tried to teach Mr. Nilsson to dance the Schottski, but he didn't want to learn. For a while she had thought of trying to teach the horse, but instead she had crept down into the wood box and pulled the cover down. She had pretended she was a sardine in a sardine box. And it was a shame Tommy and Annika weren't there so they could have been sardines too. Now it had begun to grow dark. She pressed her little pug nose against the window pane and looked out into the autumn night. She remembered that she hadn't been riding for a couple of days and decided to go at once. That would be a nice ending to a pleasant Sunday. Accordingly, she put on her big hat, fetched Mr. Nilsson from a corner where he sat playing marbles, saddled the horse, and lifted him down from the porch, and off they went, Mr. Nilsson on Pippi and Pippi on the horse. It was quite cold, and the roads were frozen, so there was a good crunchy sound as they rode along. Mr. Nilsson sat on Pippi's shoulder and tried to catch hold of some of the branches of the trees as they went by, but Pippi rode so fast that it was no use. Instead, the branches kept boxing him in the ears, and he had a hard time keeping his straw hat on his head. Pippi rode through the little town, and people pressed anxiously up against the walls when she came storming by. The town had a market square, of course. There were several charming old one-story buildings and a little yellow-painted town hall. And there was also an ugly wretch of a building, newly built and 3 stories high. It was called the Skyscraper because it was taller than any of the other houses in town. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, the little town was always quiet and peaceful. But suddenly the quiet was broken by loud cries. "The skyscraper's burning! Fire! Fire!" People came running excitedly from all directions. The fire engine came clanging down the street, and the little children who usually thought fire engines were such fun now cried from fright because they were sure their own houses would catch fire too. The police had to hold back the crowds of people gathering in the square so that the fire engine could get through. The flames came leaping out of the windows of the skyscraper, and smoke and sparks enveloped the firemen who were courageously trying to put out the fire. The fire had started on the first floor but was quickly spreading to the upper stories. Suddenly, the crowd saw a sight that made them gasp with horror. At the top of the house was a gable, and in the gable window, which a little child's hand had just opened, stood 2 little boys calling for help. "We can't get out because somebody has built a fire on the stairs," cried the older boy. He was 5 and his brother a year younger. Their mother had gone out on an errand, and there they stood all alone. Many of the people in the square began to cry, and the fire chief looked worried. There was, of course, a ladder on the fire truck, but it couldn't reach anywhere near to the little boys. To get into the house to save the children was impossible. A wave of despair swept over the crowd in the square when they realized there was no way to help the children. And the poor little things just stood up there and cried. It wouldn't be long now before the fire reached the attic. In the midst of the crowd in the square sat Pippi on her horse. She looked with great interest at the fire engine and wondered if she should buy one like it. She liked it because it was red and because it made such a fearful noise as it went through the streets. Then she looked at the fire and she thought it was fun when a few sparks fell on her. Presently, she noticed the little boys up in the attic. To her astonishment, they looked as if they weren't enjoying the fire at all. That was more than she could understand, and at last she had to ask the crowd around her, "Why are the children crying?" First, she got only sobs in answer. But finally, a stout gentleman said, "Well, what do you think? Don't you suppose you'd cry yourself if you were up there and couldn't get down?" "I never cry," said Pippi, "but if they want to get down, why doesn't somebody help them?" "Because it isn't possible, of course," said the stout gentleman. Pippi thought for a while. Then she said, "Can anybody bring me a long rope?" "What good would that do?" asked the stout gentleman. "The children are too small to get down the rope, and for that matter, how would you ever get the rope up to them?" "Oh, I've been around a bit," said Pippi calmly. "I want a rope." There was not a single person who thought it would do any good, but somehow or other Pippi got her rope. Not far from the gable of the skyscraper grew a tall tree. The top of it was almost level with the attic window, but between the tree and the window was a distance of almost 3 yards. And the trunk of the tree was smooth and had no branches for climbing on. Even Pippi wouldn't be able to climb it. The fire burned. The children in the window screamed. The people in the square cried. Pippi jumped off the horse and went up to the tree. Then she took the rope and tied it tightly to Mr. Nielsen's tail. "Now you be Pippi's good boy," she said. She put him on the tree trunk and gave him a little push. He understood perfectly what he was supposed to do, and he climbed obediently up the tree trunk. Of course, it was no trouble at all for a little monkey to do that. The people in the square held their breath and watched Mr. Nielsen. Soon he had reached the top of the tree. There he sat on a branch and looked down at Pippi. She beckoned to him to come down again. He did so at once, climbing down on the other side of the branch, so that when he reached the ground, the rope was looped over the branch and hung down double with both ends on the ground. Let's do it. Let's draw this. So here's her rope. So Mr. Nielsen takes it over. There we go. That's the rope. "Good for you, Mr. Nielsen," said Pippi. "You're so smart you can be a professor any time you wish." She untied the knot that had fastened the rope to Mr. Nielsen's tail. Nearby, a house was being repaired, and Pippi ran over and got a long board. She took the board in one hand, ran to the tree, grasped the rope in her free hand, and braced her feet against the trunk of the tree. Quickly and nimbly, she climbed up the trunk, and the people stopped crying in astonishment. When she reached the top of the tree, she placed the board over a stout branch and then carefully pushed it over to the window sill. And there lay the board like a bridge between the top of the tree and the window. There's our branch. I have to get rid of it so I can see you. The people down in the square stood absolutely silent. They were so tense they couldn't say a word. Pippi stepped out on the board. She smiled pleasantly at the two boys in the gabled window. "Why do you look so sad?" she said. "Have you got a stomach ache?" She ran across the board and hopped in at the window. "My, it seems warm in here," she said. "You don't need to make any more fire in here today, that I can guarantee. And at the most 4 sticks in the stove tomorrow, I should think." Then she took one boy under each arm and stepped out on the board again. "Now you're really going to have some fun," she said. "It's almost like walking a tightrope." When she got to the middle of the board, she lifted one leg in the air just as she had done at the circus. The crowd below gasped. And when a little lady, Pippi, lost one of her shoes, several old ladies fainted. However, Pippi reached the tree safely with the little boys. Then the crowd cheered so loudly that the dark night was filled with noise, and the sound drowned out the crackling of the fire. Pippi hauled up the rope, fastened one end securely to a branch, and tied the other one around one of the boys. Then she let him down slowly and carefully into the arms of his waiting mother, who was beside herself with joy when she had him safe. She held him close and hugged him with tears in her eyes. But Pippi yelled, "Untie the rope, for goodness sake! There's another kid up here, and he can't fly either." So the people helped to untie the rope and free the little boy. Pippi could tie good knots. She could indeed. She had learned that at sea. People at sea can always tie the most amazing knots. You should learn how to tie a couple of good knots. She pulled up the rope again, and now it was the second boy's turn to be let down. Pippi was alone in the tree. She sprang out on the board, and all the people looked at her and wondered what she was going to do. She danced back and forth on the narrow board. She raised and lowered her arms gracefully and sang in a hoarse voice that could barely be heard down on the square. The fire is burning, it's burning so bright. The flames are leaping and prancing. It's burning for you, it's burning for me, it's burning for all who are dancing. And she sang, she danced more and more wildly until many people covered their eyes in horror, for they were sure she would fall down and kill herself. Flames came leaping out of the gable window, and in the firelight people could see Pippi plainly. She raised her arms to the night sky, and while a shower of sparks fell over her, she cried loudly, "Such a jolly, jolly fire!" She took one leap and caught the rope. "Look out!" she cried, and came sliding down the rope like greased lightning. "Three cheers for Pippi Longstocking! Long may she live!" cried the fire chief. "Hip, hip, hurrah! Hip, hip, hurrah! Hip, hip, hurrah!" cried all the people 3 times. But there was one person there who cheered 4 times. It was Pippi Longstocking.